Hello, George Mason, and welcome inside the Pressbox. I'm Matt Newman.
And I'm Nathan LaPierre.
Today we're going to have a little bit more of a serious discussion over what we usually talk about. We're going to talk about what has happened recently at the University of Missouri. So as you know, the University of Missouri has been in the news quite frequently lately, dealing with a lot of social issues. And I just want to say, this is not... Here in the press box, this is not the appropriate forum to discuss those issues. I think there needs to be a more general public sphere of knowledge, more informed opinions coming into play. But we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the athletic component of it, in which the university's football team at Mizzou, they basically went on strike. They walked out and they said they were not going to play in a game until their university president had resigned because they felt that he was not dealing with the issues on campus at the time appropriately. And we're going to talk about what that means going forward for other college football programs or any college sports program, and how we feel that was how we feel that transpired. So you were talking earlier about how you think it's an example of athlete activism.
I do, yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned going on strike because there's a whole interesting debate about the rights of players, whether they have the right to hold themselves out and protest when they're getting a scholarship. Some people felt their scholarship should have been revoked. As you mentioned, it's almost like workers going on strike, and that gets into the whole, NCAA, should they get paid? That's a whole other issue. But it is another instance, I think, of this trend of athlete awareness, especially in this modern internet age we have, where these athletes really have a broad national reach.
Yeah.
And so you saw some things last year with Derrick Rose and LeBron with the "I Can't Breathe" shirts, the St. Louis Rams with the "Hands Up, Don't Shoot" message because that's obviously near Ferguson.
Yeah.
So I think you're really seeing an interesting new era where athletes are really using their platform to communicate their ideas and try to be actual leaders on the national scale.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting example of the publicity they can bring, because this had been going on for a while. But I think most of the general public would be able to say they did not know about it until they saw on ESPN that these players were going on strike.
Right.
And they were standing in solidarity with other student groups on campus. But it's just an interesting example of the power and the publicity that athletes can hold. I personally feel that, when you are an athlete, you're supposed to be a student athlete, and part of the student process, for many places, is being engaged in the on-campus environment. I mean, you don't want to be separated from that, because you're first off you're a student and then you're an athlete. So I think that's another thing that we need to discuss here when we talk about it in a general scheme. The other thing was that the coach backed him up, basically going against his own boss to stand in solidarity with his team. But let's say the coach hadn't backed them up. What would happen? Do you think this creates a precedent going forward where maybe a team could go on strike or walk out, say they're not going to participate in games in protest of their coach?
That's an interesting one, right? Because they're involved in the same program. It's really one or the other. So this did actually happen, I remember, with some coach or assistant coach, where these videos came out of him yelling at players in practice. This was a basketball coach, pegging them with basketballs and abusive stuff like that. So it's always going to be on a case-by-case basis, I think. If you have the players saying, "I don't want to play for this guy," and the coach being abusive, the athletics department really has to handle that and see who's being reasonable here and who's not. And I think that will always be a case-by-case basis. But it's interesting, athletes don't have to put up with whatever the coaches put them through, and there are conditions in which they have the rights to protest.
Yeah, I was just, let's say, some university, their coach, they've lost like 3 games in a row, and they go on protest and say like we're not going to play until the coach is fired. I mean that could be a precedent that we might not want to set.
Right.
You know? I mean,
right.
It's just an interesting concept. It'll be interesting to see if anything else like this sort of happens as we go forward. Because I mean, it certainly could. It certainly they got what they wanted. The athletes received. The president ultimately resigned. So their protest worked. They gained publicity, and I mean among other protesters as well. It was certainly not just caused by the athletic department.
Yeah, I would agree. When you mentioned that dangerous precedent, I think that's something definitely the athletics department would have to take into account. Not just, is this coach... I mean, they can decide whether they want the coach to not continue or not if they're doing a poor job,
Yeah.
but I think that would generally not be a domain where the players would have as much of an influence.
Yeah.
So I think these are all interesting discussions, but this has certainly been a big story in the news, and we wanted to touch on the athletics aspect
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah.
Without going too far.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of
a whole lot of issues related to this.
Yeah.
But thanks for tuning in today to a very serious
Yes.
episode of the Press Box.
Yes.
And I'm Nathan LaPierre.
I'm Matt Newman.
Press on, George Mason. Press
Press
on.
on.